Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who is often described in the media as right-wing because of his opposition to the European Union's open borders policies, delivered a speech on July 22 during a recent cultural festival in Bălţi, Romania, wherein he strongly criticized Hungarian-American billionaire George Soros and the EU bureaucracy in Brussels. His speech was entitled "Will Europe Belong to Europeans?" Orban raised an alarm during his speech, asking, over the next few decades the main question in Europe will be this: will Europe remain the continent of the Europeans? He expressed concern that Europe's Christian culture would become overwhelmed by the large numbers of Muslims entering the continent as refugees. He said, as regards the specific situation, and this is quite telling about the world that we live in today, there's no concrete, reliable information on the percentages of traditional indigenous Christians and the incoming Muslim communities living in Europe's individual countries. Orban placed a large part of the blame on the so-called Christian democratic parties in Europe, which he charged have become un-Christian. He stated, Europe is currently being prepared to hand its territory over to a new mixed, Islamized Europe. We are observing the conscious step-by-step implementation of this policy. In order for this to happen, for the territory to be ready to be handed over, it is necessary to continue the de-Christianization of Europe, and we can see these attempts. Priority must be given to group identities rather than national identities, and political governance must be replaced with the rule of bureaucracy. This is the aim of Brussels' continuous and stealthy withdrawal of powers from the nation-states. This is the situation in Europe today, ladies and gentlemen. This is the battlefield on which Central European countries are fighting today. The outspoken Orban pulled no punches during his talk, directing much of his criticism towards Soros, the multi-billionaire who has lavished a fortune on a host of radical organizations on both sides of the Atlantic. He described an alliance that had been forged in Brussels, the de facto capital of the EU, comprised of the Brussels bureaucrats and their political elite, and the system that may be described as the Soros Empire. Orban said, "This is an alliance which has been forged against the European people. And we must recognize that today George Soros can pursue his empire's interests more easily in Brussels than he can in Washington or Tel Aviv." Orban identified the threat to Hungary and other sovereign EU nations as a Soros plan, which he said Soros wrote himself, and the Soros Empire published it. The plan is composed of 4 points. The first plank of the plan, said Orban, is that every year hundreds of thousands of migrants, and, if possible, 1 million, should be brought into the territory of the European Union from the Muslim world. The second point is that upon arrival every one of these migrants should be given an amount in euros equivalent to 4.5 million Hungarian forints. The third point in the Soros plan is that the migrants arriving on the continent will have to be distributed among the countries of Europe as part of a mandatory and permanent mechanism. The fourth point is that a European immigration agency should be set up that will take all the decision-making powers related to migrant affairs away from the nation-states and give them to Brussels. This is the Soros plan, said Orban. The Hungarian Prime Minister ended his talk by saying that his domestic political opponents didn't have the ability to stand up to what he calls the central field of power, the external forces threatening Hungary. He said, "In the campaign facing us we'll primarily have to stand our ground against external forces. In the next 9 months we'll have to stand our ground against Soros's mafia network and the Brussels bureaucrats, and the media operated by them." Orban has sometimes been compared to Donald Trump because both leaders have promoted the use of a border wall or fence to keep out migrants. In his talk, Orban defended Hungary's use of such a border fence, stating, "We shouldn't forget that Hungary, with the aid of the V4, for which we are grateful, was the country which stopped the migrant invasion flooding into Europe. And I made it clear earlier, and I'll repeat this now, for as long as I am the Prime Minister of Hungary, at the head of the Fidesz and Christian Democratic government, The border fence will remain in place and we shall protect our borders. And in doing so we shall also protect Europe. In contrast to this, the opposition in Hungary openly states that they'll dismantle the fence and let immigrants into the country. Orban emphasized that Hungary's border fences, supported by other Central European countries, will block the EU's effort to increase Muslim migration into Europe. He explained during his talk that his motivation for such actions is to preserve Hungary's Christian culture. He said that he opposed admitting migrants who could change the country's cultural identity, and that under his leadership, Hungary would remain a place where Western European Christians will always be able to find security.